Welcome back, everyone. We are going to start off by discussing a high-level overview of Azure networking with our lesson called Azure Networking Concepts. In this lesson, we are going to take a high-level view of how Azure Virtual Networks are the core that makes Azure networking possible, especially when it comes to private networking. Next, we are going to discuss some of the basics of working with a virtual network, or a VNet for short. And we're going to take a quick look at the variety of communications that are possible working with Azure Virtual Networks. So jumping on into it, you may be noticing a bit of a theme at this point in which this section is starting off with the basics or the fundamentals, and that is exactly what we are trying to do. As we mentioned in our course prerequisites in the previous section, most of this should be a review for you in which you should already be familiar with the core networking concepts, whether we're working with Azure or any other network. However, any advanced course on networking on Azure really needs to start off with the primary fundamentals of Azure networking, in which we need to establish the same base level of understanding that we are going to be working from through the rest of this course. And in fact, these first few sections in this course are going to act as building blocks or core concepts that are going to be referenced into every other discussion throughout the rest of this course, specifically the core fundamentals of networks, DNS, and routing. So starting off with the basics, let's talk about the primary core of Azure networking. First of all, virtual networks on Azure are required for private networking within the Azure space. Now, key terminology here, when we are discussing private networking, we are referring to the RFC, or Request for Common Standards, of 1918. Those of you who have previously worked in the networking space should be familiar with this term, in which RFC 1918 is always referring to private network communication, not public internet communication. And these are often encompassed from an IP range of the Class A, B, and C addresses, which we are going to talk about in a bit more detail in the next lesson. Virtual networks are also a core component of hybrid networking for scenarios in which we need to securely and privately connect Azure resources with other non-Azure resources, such as an Office on-premises network. With that in mind, let's now move on to discussing the core basics of the structure of a virtual network. First of all, we need to know that virtual networks are the required home for all virtual machines or virtual computers in our Azure network. You cannot create a virtual machine on Azure without a virtual network for that virtual machine to live in. Now, granted, you can create a virtual machine without first creating a virtual network. However, when you do so, Azure will actually create a virtual network as you create that virtual machine, which will be populated only with that single VM. Every virtual machine must have a virtual network. At the very top level of a virtual network structure, you have one or more address ranges. These one or more address ranges can also contain one or more subnets, and it is the subnets that our virtual machines exist in. And you also need to know that virtual networks are bound to a single region. Currently on Azure, there are no multi-regional virtual networks. However, we do have options of connecting multiple virtual networks across regions with a variety of connection methods we'll talk about in more detail later on in this course. With that in mind, even though a virtual network is bound to a single region, for regions with multiple availability zones, that virtual network can span every availability zone within that single region. In this example on the right side, if we had a virtual network in the central US region, it could only exist in the central US region. However, that network and its subnets can exist in every availability zone within that region as well. Wrapping up this initial introductory lesson, let's take a quick high-level overview of the different methods of communications that virtual networks enable on Azure. First is public networking. Even though virtual networks are geared toward private networking, public networking is an option as well. You can assign public IP addresses to individual virtual machines inside of your network, and these addresses can be in IPv4 or IPv6 format. Within our individual virtual network, all resources in that virtual network can communicate with each other. Whether it is within the same subnet or other subnets in the same VNet, everything is able to communicate privately with everything else. Virtual networks also act as a core component of a variety of managed services, both managed network services and other ones as well, and again, these can communicate over both public and private network communications. Moving beyond our single virtual network, we also have the ability to privately peer one VNet to another VNet and which virtual networks, whether in the same region or other regions, are able to have private communications between those networks. Expanding beyond Azure, we have a variety of hybrid connection scenarios in which our virtual net is the center of it, which enables private communications not just within Azure, but with other non-Azure locations as well, whether it is an on-premises network or networks in other clouds. And then finally, in all of these scenarios, we have security methods which filter network traffic either within the virtual network, outside the virtual network, publicly or privately, which include either network security groups or Azure Firewall. Be aware that this is only a high-level overview, and we are going to expand on all of these topics in much more detail as we go along in this course. With that, that's going to wrap up our initial high-level introduction of the basics of how Azure Virtual Networks work. Again, most of this should be a review to our ideal audience. However, we did want to take some time to establish the baseline level of understanding, which is going to act as the core of really every other discussion in the rest of this course. So I did want to take some time to go ahead and establish those basics. To wrap up our key takeaways from this lesson, we learned how the virtual network on Azure is the core network building block, which is the primary construct for both private and public communications. We also learned about the high-level structure of a virtual network, in which virtual networks are bound to a single region. Those VNets can have one or more address spaces, and the address spaces can contain one or more subnets, which is where all of our individual resources are created. And then finally, we took a high-level preview of the variety of network communications that we are going to discuss in more detail throughout this course, which includes public communications, communications within a single virtual network, hybrid communications, peering connections, and a variety of managed services. This is going to conclude our initial introduction of Azure networking concepts. Let's now move on to our next introductory lesson and taking a closer look at IP addressing within Azure, and I'll see you in the next lesson.